Hello and welcome to the second video of section 2, a high-level architectural overview. In this second video, we're going to start by looking at a high-level Horizon architecture and how it delivers desktops and applications to the end users. We will then dive a little deeper into the architecture and describe each component in more detail and how it works. These components being the View Connection Server, the View Security Server, a View Replica Server, a View Enrollment Server, and then finally the VMware Access Point. So let's begin by building a picture of the whole Horizon environment, including all the required supporting infrastructure and optional functionality, with our starting point being the infrastructure used to host the solution. In actual fact, there are two sets of infrastructure. The infrastructure hosting the Horizon View components, such as the connection servers, and then another separate set of infrastructure used to host the virtual desktop machines. We will talk about this in a bit more detail later on in this course when we take a look at the Horizon View reference architectures. So for now, let's just continue to look at the other requirements. To finish off the core infrastructure, we also need to add in our Active Directory. Then we need to add in a SQL Server for the View Events database and also for the View Composer database if you're going to be using linked clone virtual desktops. And of course a vCenter server. When it comes to vCenter, as we mentioned previously, there are different infrastructure requirements and therefore in reality you will have multiple vCenter servers within your environment. We will cover this when we take a look at the Horizon View reference architecture again. Now let's move on to the first parts of the actual Horizon View infrastructure and the core connection server and replica servers. We'll start with the internal based users. Here, an internal user connects using their endpoint device, firstly via a load balancer, if you have multiple connection servers, and then in turn they are connected to a connection server. In turn, the connection server connects that user to their virtual desktop machine that is running on the hosting infrastructure. So what about external users? Now we moved into the DMZ and the View security servers, and also your external users. External users are those that are connecting from outside of your internal network, using things such as the internet. In a similar way to how an internal user connects, the external user first of all launches a Horizon client or a browser on their endpoint device. The user is then connected via an external facing load balancer to the View security servers in the DMZ. The connection is then passed into the internal network and then onto another set of connection servers, which are paired with security servers. The final step is that the user is connected to their virtual desktop, which is then delivered to the client running on the endpoint device. An alternative to using the security servers is the new access point appliance. The access point doesn't require pairing with a connection server, so is easily scalable. It works in exactly the same way, however. An external end user launches the Horizon client or browser on their endpoint device and connects to the access point. They are then connected to the internal network once authenticated and then onto the connection servers, and finally they are connected to their virtual desktop machine. To complete this section, we will finish off by looking at a few other features, starting with View Composer. Working alongside vCenter, Composer takes a parent image and creates a linked clone virtual desktop machine. We will talk about linked clones in a bit more detail later on in this course. Other desktops are built using full clones, and then the latest Horizon 7 feature, instant clones. The last of the features and functionality we're going to add to this architecture is for app volumes. This will take care of our application layering, and then finally we'll add in VMware ThinApp. ThinApp in this context is literally just a shared folder containing the virtualized and packaged applications. So now we've looked at the high-level architecture, let's now start to look at each component in a little bit more detail. The first and probably the most important part of the solution is the Horizon View Connection Server, sometimes referred to as a connection broker or the View Manager. It is the central component of the View infrastructure and could probably be described as actually being View itself. Its role is to connect an end user to their virtual desktop or application by authenticating the user and then delivering the appropriate desktop resource or application based on that particular user's profile and what they're entitled to consume. When logging onto your virtual desktop and you enter the address of a server you are connecting to, then this is the connection server that you are communicating with. A user will typically connect to their virtual desktop machine from their endpoint device by launching the Horizon client, but equally they could use browser-based access. So what happens next, and how does the login process work? First of all, the end user launches the Horizon client and then enters the address details of the View connection server, or in this example, a load balancer. A connection is then made via the load balancer to a connection server. The connection server responds by asking the end user to enter their network login details, i.e. their Active Directory AD domain username and password. These credentials are then passed back to the connection server. These credentials are authenticated with Active Directory, and if successful, the user is able to log on. Depending on what they are entitled to use, the user would see a launch screen that displays a number of different virtual desktop machines or application icons that are available for them to launch. These desktop icons represent the desktop and application pools that the user has been entitled to use. A pool is basically a collection of similar virtual desktop machines. For example, it could be a pool for the marketing department, where the virtual desktop machines contain specific applications or software for use with that department. We'll discuss desktop pools in greater detail later on in this course. So once authenticated, in this example, the connection server makes a call to the vCenter server to create a virtual desktop machine. And then vCenter makes a call to the View Composer to create a virtual desktop for the user if there's not one available. Once the build process is completed and the virtual desktop machine is available to the end user, it is displayed or delivered within the View client window using the chosen display protocol, that being PC over IP, Blast Extreme, or RDP. The Horizon View security server is another component in the architecture and is essentially another version of the View connection server, but this time, as we saw in the high-level architecture, it sits within your DMZ so that you can allow end users to securely connect to the virtual desktop machine from an external network or the internet. A couple of points to note with the security server is that you cannot install the View security server on the same machine that is already running as a connection server, or any other Horizon View component for that matter. You should also not join the security server to your domain. To start with, the user login process at the beginning is the same as when connecting to a View connection server. Essentially because the security server is just another version of the connection server, running a subset of the features with the exclusion of the Adam database. The difference is that you connect to the address of the security server instead. The security server sits inside your DMZ and communicates with a connection server sitting on the internal network that it is paired with. So now we've added an extra security layer as the internal connection server is not exposed externally, with the idea being that users can now access their virtual desktop machines externally without the need to first connect to a VPN or the network. When the user logs in from the View client, they now use the external URL of the security server to access the connection server, which in turn authenticates the user against AD and checks entitlements, as with the usual login process we described previously. If the connection server is configured as a PC over IP gateway, then it will pass the connection and addressing information to the View client. This connection information will allow the View client to connect to the security server using PC over IP. The security server will then forward the PC over IP connection to the virtual desktop machine, creating the connection for the user. The virtual desktop is then displayed and delivered within the View client window using the chosen display protocol, again PC over IP, Blast, or RDP. The Horizon View replica server serves two key purposes. The first is that it is used to enable high availability to your Horizon View environment. Having a replica of your connection server means that if the connection server fails, users are still able to connect to their virtual desktop machines. Secondly, adding replica servers allows you to scale up the number of users and virtual desktop connections. An individual instance of a connection server can support up to 2,000 connections, so adding additional connection servers allows you to add another 2,000 users at a time, up to the maximum of 5 connection servers and 10,000 users per Horizon View pod. We will discuss what pod and block architecture means later on in this course. When deploying a replica server, you will need to change the IP address or update the DNS record to match this server if you are not using a load balancer. As with the security server, you will see that the installation process is again almost the same as the connection server, but this time you select the replica server role from the drop-down menu during installation. So the first question is, what actually gets replicated and why is it called the replica server? The connection server stores all of its information relating to end users, desktop pools, virtual machines, and other View-related objects in an Active Directory Application Mode Database, or ADAM. Then, using LDAP, it uses a method similar to the one that Active Directory uses for replication. The View information gets copied from the original connection server to the replica server, hence why it's called a replica server. As both the connection server and the replica server are now identical to each other, if your connection server fails, then you essentially have a backup that steps in and takes over, so that end users can continue to connect to their virtual desktops. Just like with the other components, you cannot install the replica server on the same machine that's running as a connection server or any other View component. The Horizon View enrollment server is the final component that is part of the Horizon View connection server installation options, and is selected again from the installation options screens when you install the connection server. So what does the enrollment server do? Horizon 7 sees the introduction of a new feature that's called True SSO, or Single Sign-On. True SSO is a solution that allows a user to authenticate to a Microsoft Windows environment without them having to enter their AD credentials. It integrates into another VMware product, VMware Identity Manager, which forms part of both Horizon 7 Advanced and Enterprise editions. Its job is to sit between the connection server and the Microsoft Certificate of Authority, and is used to request temporary certificates from the certificate store. A user first logs into the VMware Identity Manager using their credentials or other authentication method, such as RSA or Radius. Once successfully authenticated, the user will be presented with the virtual desktop machines or hosted applications that they are entitled to use. They can launch any of these by simply double-clicking. In this example, the user is going to launch a Horizon View virtual desktop machine by clicking the relevant icon. The Horizon client is now launched. The user's credentials will then be passed to the connection server, which in turn will verify them by sending a security assertion markup language, or SAML assertion, back to the Identity Manager. If the user's credentials are verified, then the connection server passes them to the enrollment server. The enrollment server then makes a request to the Microsoft Certificate of Authority, or CA, to generate a short-lived temporary certificate for that user to use. With the certificate now generated, the connection server presents it to the operating system of the virtual desktop machine, which in turn validates with Active Directory as to whether or not the certificate is authentic. When the certificate has been authenticated, then the end user is logged onto their virtual desktop machine, which will then be displayed and delivered to the View client using the chosen protocol. VMware Access Point performs exactly the same functionality as the View security server as shown in the diagram, with one key difference. Instead of being a Windows application and another role of the connection server, the access point is a separate virtual appliance that runs a hardened, locked-down Linux-based operating system. Although the access point appliance delivers pretty much the same functionality as a security server, it does not yet completely replace it, especially if you already have a production deployment that uses the security server for external access. You can continue to use this architecture. If you are using the Secure Tunnel function, PC over IP Secure Gateway, or the Blast Secure Gateway features of the connection server, then these features will need to be disabled on the connection server if you are using the access point. They are all enabled by default on the access point appliances themselves. The key difference between the access point appliances and the security server is in the way that it scales. Before you had to pair a security server with a connection server, which was quite a limitation, but this is no longer the case. As such, you can now scale to as many access point appliances as you need for your environment, with a maximum limit being around 2,000 sessions for a single appliance. Adding additional appliances is simply a case of just deploying an appliance, as appliances don't depend on other appliances and do not communicate with them. They communicate directly with the connection servers. In the next video, we're going to start to talk about how a virtual desktop machine is assigned to an end user using persistence or non-persistence.